Okay, welcome back to our discussion on the Negro League Dream Team canvas that I'm going to be making as part of the Negro League Baseball Museum, their art event and their celebration for the 100th year anniversary of the Negro Leagues. We've got 3 players who have been suggested to be the second baseman. It's quite interesting, guys. We kind of talked about this a bit briefly earlier, but we've got Bingo DeMoss, we've got Georgescales, and we've got Sammy T Hughes, and none of these 3 players are in the Hall of Fame. I don't know if we should talk about that now or whether we need to talk about that individually for each player, but where do you think that is? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, they say the definition of a second baseman is a failed shortstop. In other words, a guy with a good glove who doesn't have the range or the arm. But I looked up the stats, and actually, if you subtract the Negro Leaguers, white Hall of Famers are almost evenly split between shortstops and second basemen. So there's clearly not an overriding Hall of Fame bias against second basemen. Yeah, but the only second baseman among the 35 black baseball people is Frank Grant, who played in the 19th century, and so needless to say, is not on our radar here.
I think it's.
I'm not sure why. How about that?
I think it's what we talked about to some degree, what we talked about in one of our previous videos. You've got Bingo DeMoss, who is playing with a lot of his career in the pre-1920, and so I think that automatically, and of course he's in a double play combination a lot of time with Pop Lloyd, and so recognizing Lloyd and seeing Lloyd, Moss. And then Scales and the one that surprises me the most of the 3, because to Jim's point about longevity, is Scales, because Scales is around for 26 years. He's got the longest of the 3, and Sammy T Hughes has the shortest. But again, I think maybe in some cases it might be the teams they played for. In the case of both Scales and Hughes, not necessarily finding themselves often on the Crawfords and the Grays and the big, Hughes, they played for the Baltimore Elite Giants, things like that. So that may account for, and sometimes I think it's, again, playing in some of those cities, the lack of newspaper coverage and things that don't give them the kinds of stories that you see with some of the others. So I think that's some of the explanation.
When you talk
I would agree with Leslie. I do want to just point out, it wasn't that there wasn't great second baseman, because Newt Allen is a great one, and he's not here. And Bill Monroe, of course, he's early. He was a great one. Piper Davis is a pioneer into the integration of baseball. So there were candidates, but
absolutely,
it's a mystery.
Right. Yep. Okay. All right. Well, let's start looking at each of these gentlemen one at a time. We've got the first one we'll look at will be Bingo DeMoss. I've got him down as being born in 1889 and dying in 1965. He obviously played quite early on, like in the well, kind of I guess some of it was pre-Negro Leagues from the 1920s. And I was saying earlier also, his stats aren't particularly high when they're normalised, but I guess this is partly because of the dead ball era that he was playing in. But what would we say about him?
Well, normalized or not, he really wasn't a very good hitter. Sub below average. However, he's here for a reason. If you go to that list of top 50 second basemen by WAR, his fielding WAR is 10.3. That's a lot. Fielding WAR is the lesser of ordinarily the lesser of the 2 components for a hitter or a position player. 10.3 is a lot. There's nobody on the list even within hailing distance of his fielding WAR, and that tends, and his rep, and again, a lot of it is gained before league play, and a lot of black newspaper coverage. His reputation is as a really good glove man, and it looks like that's right.
Yeah. And it also appears he was well respected by the other players. He's referred to it often as a gentleman. A number of the players and managers talked about his keen knowledge of the game and how that helped his fielding. He understood the game. He knew where to. And Dave Millarcher, who Eddie knows, talks about him and sang his praises and said that he was the finest fielder that you would ever see. He understood the game in a way he had never seen anybody else really have that kind of just innate knowledge of what was happening on the field. And I think that's accounts for the high WAR that he has when you compare, and even on his overall compare, because they do a couple comparison lists, and when you compare him to those of his time period, so he's not being compared to Scales and Hughes, he comes out as number one in the overall WAR as well, and with those that he's being compared to in the time that he played. And so I think that that's and as I said, he played alongside Pop Lloyd, so they made an incredible double play combination during their time together.
I saw also, I think it was on the Negro League Museum's website, I'm not sure, but it said that he played for two of the greatest managers of their day, Rube Foster, and is it Charles I. Sean Taylor?
Yep.
Yeah, Charles Isham
Yes.
Taylor, C.I. Taylor.
Would you,
And
I mean, I hadn't heard of Charles I. Sean Taylor before. Would you be able to tell us a little bit maybe about both of those managers and how they were?
He had a big problem concerning his fame, which is he caught pneumonia and died in his prime as a manager and owner. But he was one of the founders of the Negro National League in 1920. He owned the Indianapolis ABCs, which was the league team in Indianapolis. He'd been a player way back. Then he was a manager, and then he was an owner. He was highly respected. Had he not suffered an early demise, he'd probably be rattling around in the Hall of Fame owners or one of those people. How can you leave him off? Well, he's sort of in that category anyway, but he'd really be in that category.
He died in 1921 at one point, so.
Yeah, right. So he's a bit like Chino Smith that we talked about before. Was such a, influential, and Chino had such a good career, but it was so short.
Well, it's longer than Chino certainly was, but unfortunately not on the Negro League side of things. Just as things start to.
Yeah. Okay.
So he dies in 1921. I mean, the Indianapolis ABCs of the teens are based on, again, they're playing barnstorming and things like that, but their records are, the teams he had and the records they had are pretty impressive. And so, and of course, he and Foster had an interesting relationship. They didn't necessarily like one another too much, and they argued a great deal. And it's fun to read the argument because, unlike today, I think to a certain degree, they put their arguments in full into the newspapers. They wrote back and forth to one another and essentially argued in the newspapers. So we have lots of the interaction between Foster and C.I. Taylor with some of their disagreements over how the league should and how things should happen. And part of it, I think, was both highly capable men, and that often put them in conflict with one another.
One other point on Bingo is everyone's alluded to. The Pittsburgh Courier poll, they put Jackie Robinson at second, which was kind of cheating because the poll that takes place in 52 and he's in his fifth year or so in the majors. But Bingo's on the second team, meaning the Courier poll says DeMoss was the best Negro League second baseman, during the league era and before.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. That's Bingo DeMoss. Let's move on to our second baseman, or nominated second baseman, Georgescales.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. It's all right. Born in 1900 and died in 1976. Ted.
I'd like to start here because Georgescales is dear to me because of the man who told me about him. And this would have been at the Malloy Conference. I think it was 2013 in Newark. But I was with Dick Clark, the late Dick Clark, is a friend to all of us. And somehow we were talking about second baseman. We were in Yogi Berra's museum. And he opened my eyes with these four stats: 25-year career, 26-year career, 300 batting average, 400 on base average, and a 500 slugging average for a second baseman. And I've been a Georgescales fan ever since. And I just want to add one more thing. Defensively, Georgescales gets a terrible reputation. They say he was like Hornsby. However, if you look at the stats, his overall defensive runs saved is negative. He was a bad fielder, but 14.6 positive as a second baseman. That's like in the top 15 of all time. And then he's negative 15.8 everywhere else he played, including even worse than that at third base. So his glove at second base really can't be sneezed at. And then when you throw the stats that Dick beat me to, he's a remarkable, and then as Jim mentioned, longevity. I don't know how Georgescales has fallen through the cracks.
Well, and to add to Ted's, he's ninth listed for slugging percentage amongst all Negro Leaguers, and the 8 above him are all in the Hall of Fame. So he's the only one in the top 10. Yeah. He's ninth, and he is not. He played with our next in 38. He was actually the third baseman, while Sammy T Hughes, the next guy we're talking about, was the second baseman. So they were on the same team. But the thing I think that's interesting, to Ted's point, because I looked this up because I wondered about why, and I wonder if this might be maybe some of the explanation for Scales. You know, we were talking yesterday about like Dahigo, who played multiple positions and things. So when you look up what's listed for Scales, I mean, think about this. He's listed as playing 325 games at second base, 269 at third, 95 at first, 94 at shortstop. If you put all together his entire outfield, he didn't play right field. He played the other two. He played 66 games. He pitched 3. So we're not talking about somebody who played 10 or 20 at other positions. He played significantly across, and I think that often can affect. And so it would suggest to me that and his stats would suggest that, right? That what kept him in the field was his hitting. There's no DH in the leagues, so there's nowhere else to put in. You can't hide him, and so they needed his bat, and so I think so they kept him in. And unfortunately, outside of second base, he wasn't. It doesn't appear that his fielding was that, and that may be simply you never sort of get settled in at one spot. But he played a lot at other positions.
He's sort of the anti-DeMoss. Bad glove, great bat.
Yeah.
Played for a long time. I think another thing that disadvantaged him, he dropped out of league play in the early to mid-30s and went to play for the New York Black Yankees, which at that time was an independent team. They were unquestionably of league caliber, although probably when they did join the league, they didn't do very well, but they were, they could hold their own. So you've got, now it's just sort of, it's going to be what people call the golden era of the Negro Leagues. The second Negro League, National League, is formed after the Depression in 1933. Then the Negro American League forms in the mid-30s, and now you've got a 2-league World Series competition, and it's all focused on league play. And where's George? George is out playing, well compensated, and that's why he went. You got to make a living. You got to make a buck. He had talent to sell. George is playing with the New York Black Yankees, who were looked down upon by the other owners to a great extent, and somewhat after they got in the league too. But before they got in the league, definitely, they were an independent league. They're stealing our players like Georgescales because we can't stop them because they're not subject to our rules. They're in league with people we don't like, who called booking agents, who control access to the parks around New York City. We have to pay what we feel are exorbitant fees for the rights to play in those parks, where we could book these things ourselves if we didn't have this monopoly squashing us. So George kind of went over kind of to the bad guys for a while. And not that he was a bad guy, but I think that blows a hole in his continuity, even though he was playing ball. He was playing for the wrong side, so to speak.
On that 52 poll, he is listed as 4th because you got Jackie, Bingo, Bill Monroe, and then Georgescales. So they recognize, but I think you put all these pieces together, and I think that explains why people, first of all, don't know very much about George, and then why he doesn't get the consideration that you might think he should.
But if the process had continued after 2006, I'm sure he'd be in. He was on the final ballot at what, 39. He just didn't get the required number of votes to be one of the 17. We would have made it 18, I guess. But he was there. He was in competition. If the selection process had come along, I'm sure he'd be in by now.
Agreed.
When you talk about players being, sorry, Ted, when you talk about players, because they're an independent team, they didn't have to abide by the rules of the league, so they could basically poach players. How did scouting work back in the Negro Leagues? Was it similar to, well, I'm going to say today, but it's hard to say about today, but because there's not much going on in terms of that. But the scouting, was there a formal way in which that happened? Would team have scouts they'd send out to different teams to look at certain players, or how would scouting work in the Negro Leagues?
Sort of, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of word of mouth. Owners had their connections. Former players, Oscar Charleston, going back to Oscar, was sort of connected to everybody. You can find letters in old business files and stories about Oscar dropping a tip here and a tip there, and of course he's the guy you would listen to. Sometimes they would owners would have somebody on their team connected with the team who'd go out and scout. Cumberland Posey, who was the primary owner of the Grays, his older brother Seward worked for the Grays as he started out driving one of the cars to games and wound up being essentially his brother's second-hand man. He would send him out separately, and he'd go scouting players. He'd picked up. He went to. I know this because I used to live around Albany, New York. He went to Albany, New York, to watch the Albany Black Sox, who played in this high-quality semi-pro league, and came back with Edsel Walker, a left-handed pitcher who starred for the Grays for many years. So there were all kinds of things. Abe Manley, who was co-owner of the Eagles, had a lot. He was from the Virginia Tidewater area, and he had a lot of connections down there. And people would give him tips all the time, and he'd send people down. And the Eagle files through great good fortune and good luck, is all they can say, have survived and are archived in the Newark Library, and they include all sorts of fascinating things. He sent somebody down to pick up a player, and the deal was, don't let the team know you're coming. He's basically going to swipe this guy from under the owner's nose. Right. Some semi-pro team, and his agent telegraphs back, send $25 so we can get home. My clothes are in hock. So it was really a multifaceted shoestring operation to find players.
And then sometimes it was simply they barnstormed so much. That's how you made, and you played against other teams, and so you saw players. And sometimes you literally took them right from that game, and they would take them with them, or they made that connection and they knew, and they would then seek out. And so a lot of it, that's a lot of where the word of the mouth came, was simply they played so many places and they got to see, and they barnstormed, in spring training from the South all the way. And so they played in teams in a lot of these semi-pro and much smaller leagues, and the Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana League, and some of these kinds of things. And they saw all kinds of players. And so that was a huge part of how they found them.
Yeah, incredible. Very interesting. Okay. Sorry, Ted, we were talking, shall we carry on with George?
Well, yeah, I want to bridge Scales to Hughes, but the thing that they have several things in common, but the one that stood out for me, they both mentored Jim Gilliam on the, I guess, the Baltimore Elite Giants. So that's a connection to our third person, which, Andy, I believe you're going to introduce.
Let's do that. Let's absolutely do that. So we've got our last second baseman to discuss, who is Sammy T Hughes, born in 1910, died in 1981. Again, he's in the Pittsburgh Courier article that went out. What should we say about him? What are the highlights?
Well, for me, what always attracted me was his appearances in the All-Star game. Although it turns out upon closer inspection, his performance wasn't all that great. But he's an annual voted to the East-West Classic. And before Dick Clark told me about Scales, Sammy T Hughes, pretty much for that reason alone, was my favorite candidate. But other things that I've now found.
Ted, before you carry on, sorry to stop your flow there, but just because you're talking about the East-West All-Stars game, could you tell us a bit about how were the players selected for that game? Like, how did it work back then?
For the most part, by the fans in newspaper polls in Chicago or Pittsburgh, the Courier or the Defender. And so the fans voted for their favorite players, which I'm grateful. In 1934, Rap Dixon had a miserable season, but the fans remembered and still voted him to the team. So that was the principal way to get on the team.
All right. Thank you very much. Sorry, Ted. Carry on. I don't know if you can pick up.
Well, I was just knocking around a few other Sammy T Hughes points. I think it was Jim Riley that noted he was on 13 championship teams, summer and winter leagues, foreign and domestic. And the last point I want to make here is he's the only person in our discussion oh no, that's not true. Him and Dick Lundy that we talked about yesterday are the only two that we will discuss that were on the original ballot back in 1971. So Sammy T Hughes has been considered by the Hall and its panels for as long as anybody.
Mm-hmm. He doesn't have the longevity issue, I think, is against Sammy, because if I'm correct, it's only 14 years that he was around. Appears to have been a pretty solid hitter, 315, normalized hitter. Described as a solid hitter, not a power hitter or anything, but connected well. Those and you could count on him to come through in the clutch. He lost some of his years because he served in World War II, and he served a significant amount of time. I think it was 4 years. He went in 42 and came out in 46. So he loses 4 years of, and so I think that certainly didn't help necessarily for Hughes.
Yes, these guys who played up against the integration of the major leagues, Dandridge is another good example. Their careers look short, and you say, well, that's not so hot. Well, Dandridge went on to, I think, 4 or 5 years in high level, not low level, high level, AAA ball. The Giants signed him. He hit over 300. He had 300. The Giants had Monty Irvin. They had Hank Thompson. Then they had Willie Mays, and they didn't want to have too many black guys. And Ray was already in his late 30s, so he stayed down. Hughes, the Negro National League started to decline. It actually was out of business. One of the two leagues went out of business after the 1948 season. A lot of those guys, the good guys, migrated to the now integrated minor leagues, hopefully to make the majors. Like most cases, they didn't, but that's true. That was true of their white counterparts too. And so it looks like their careers kind of tailed off. Of course, they kept going, not for the reason we're discussing things today, but they didn't stop playing ball. And some played very well at a lower level.
There was something that I wanted to pick you up on or ask you about as well. Oh, that was it. Yesterday, Leslie, you mentioned a gentleman, I think, called Alex Pompez. And you were talking about how he helped players come over from Cuba or something. But I don't know anything about him, to be honest. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little story about this gentleman.
Anybody can jump in. But I would simply say if people want to learn more about Alejandro Pompez, you just have to pick up Adrian Burgos's book. Adrian has written a book specifically about Cuban. It's called Cuban Star, right? Am I
Yeah, I see.
remember it correctly? It's all about Alejandro Pompez as owner and scout, essentially, and a little bit of a scoundrel as well, depending on how you read about Pompez, because Pompez was essentially the part of the pipeline to bring players up from Latin America into the Negro Leagues. He talking about, as we were just talking about previously, with connections that you had. That's what Pompez had. He had all the connections back into Latin America, and he brought many players. Owner of a team in the New York area for many years. Got himself in a little bit of hot water for the numbers game kind of approaches and some of those kinds of things. So had to leave the country and come back, and but scouting was what essentially he did in addition to his owning of the team.
And subsequently scouting for the New York Giants, San Francisco Giants, Juan Marichal, the Alous, I think Cepeda, all were linked to Pompez's work.
And would he be counted to being similar to an agent as well? Would he be, or was he finding the players and then, but would he be doing part of the dealing as well? Or?
I bet you he probably was for certain players, but because there were no agents back then.
Yeah.
Pompez certainly wasn't doing it without gaining something himself.
Of course, either are today's.
He was working for the Giants, and I don't know if he was working on a salary or if he was getting a cut, when he signed a player. But he signed a lot of good players. And he got elected to the Hall in 2006, along with 3 other owners. And, I mean, his teams played well. They won. You're pretty much, to be in as an owner in the Hall, you've got to win a pennant or 2, and you've got to at least be in or hopefully win a World Series in your white or black neighborhood, and he did that. But I think the thing that put him over was the way he brought Caribbean players to the majors, particularly to the Giants. He was a real strong pipeline, and that's an aspect of integration too. I mean, these were guys who could not have played before 1947, but they weren't just in the Negro Leagues. They were way south of there, and somebody had to activate that pipeline, and Alex did.
And the best example of that, as far as Pompez, is Cepeda, whose father was a spectacular player and wouldn't come up here to put up with the nonsense he would have had to do.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was just a little added extra, which we had mentioned before in a previous video. So that's great. Okay. So those were our 3 second basemen, Bingo DeMoss, Georgescales, and Sammy T Hughes. And that concludes the videoing for this evening. So thank you very much to Ted, Jim, and Leslie, as ever, for your knowledge and your support and your sharing your knowledge and support today. So thank you so much. And I hope everybody's enjoyed watching the video. Okay. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Now, what about the next time?